Welcome to Clandestine Cases, where captivating stories and mysteries come to life. Make sure to subscribe and join us on this exciting journey of suspense and intrigue. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can improve our content. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your feedback means a lot to us. Miss Marple and the Deadly Tune. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Mystery. Miss Jane Marple sat in the warm, comfortable surroundings of her small, well-ordered cottage in St. Mary Mead, her hands occupied with her knitting as she reread the letter that had arrived that morning. It was from Lady Eleanor Danforth, an old acquaintance, though not one she had seen in some years. The note was written in an elegant, sloping script, the kind one rarely saw these days. Precise, deliberate, yet touched with a faint nervousness in the way the words slightly leaned into each other. My dear Jane, it has been far too long since we last saw each other, and I do hope this invitation finds you well. Sir Reginald insists on hosting one of his little dinners. He does so love to play the grand host, as you may recall, and I would be delighted if you could join us at Ashworth Manor this Friday. There will be a small gathering, nothing too tedious, I assure you. Reginald's nephew Henry will be there, as well as Mr. Weston, his solicitor, and Bernard Hale. You may remember the pianist. Rather a difficult man, but brilliant in his way. His secretary, a rather solemn fellow named Oliver Graves, will of course be in attendance, though I must say he gives me the shivers. I know how sharp your instincts are, Jane, and I confess, though I am perhaps being foolish, that I feel a certain tension in the household of late. Reginald has been speaking of altering his will again, and naturally that has stirred up all sorts of emotions. Perhaps I am letting my imagination run away with me, but I would feel ever so much easier knowing that you were present. With warmest regards, Eleanor. Miss Marple read the letter twice through before setting it down beside her teacup. A slight frown crossed her delicate features. There was something about the tone of Eleanor's letter that unsettled her, not the invitation itself, but rather the hint of some underlying unease. Lady Danforth had always been a woman of composure, not prone to nerves. For her to confess, even in such a genteel, roundabout manner, that she felt ill at ease, suggested that something was indeed amiss. Of course, she was well acquainted with the name of Sir Reginald Ashworth, even if she had only met him on one or two occasions. A man of considerable wealth, once celebrated for his talent as a pianist in his youth, he had over the years become known for his sharp temper and an almost tyrannical love of routine. There were tales of former protégés whom he had taken under his wing, only to discard them when they failed to meet his impossible standards. His reputation, in short, was that of a difficult, often unpleasant man, though never one to shirk from society when it suited him. Miss Marple had encountered many such men in her lifetime. Men who thought themselves the center of their own small universes, who saw others as mere players in the grand drama of their existence. They were dangerous in their own way, not because they wielded knives or pistols, but because they wielded power, the kind that could ruin lives with a mere signature on a piece of paper. And then, of course, there was the mention of the will. That single detail intrigued her more than any other. A will, particularly one in the process of being altered, was always a source of great interest to human nature. There were very few occasions in life that could stir up the darker emotions as effectively as the question of inheritance. Greed, resentment, long-held grudges, Miss Marple had seen them all manifest in the wake of a contested will. It was the kind of situation that often ended in tragedy. With a small, decisive nod to herself, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. She would, of course, accept the invitation. The journey from St. Mary Mead to Ashworth Manor was not a long one, but it provided Miss Marple ample time to consider what she might expect upon arrival. She imagined the guests, each carefully selected by Sir Reginald, though not necessarily to their own comfort. The nephew, Henry Ashworth, would no doubt have a great deal to say about the new arrangements for the will. The solicitor, Mr. Weston, would likely spend the evening tiptoeing around the subject, trying not to reveal too much while attempting to maintain his client's trust. And Bernard Hale, yes, she did recall the name, a man who had once been a rising star in the musical world, only to fade into quiet obscurity. And then there was the secretary, a man who gave Eleanor the shivers. That was interesting. Secretaries often knew more than anyone else in a household. They were privy to letters, financial matters, personal affairs. They observed much, said little. And yet, Miss Marple had learned long ago that people who were accustomed to being overlooked often made the most fascinating of murderers. As the car made its way up the long, tree-lined drive of Ashworth Manor, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. It was, she thought wryly, a perfect setting for murder. The great house loomed before her, a sprawling Georgian estate, its windows aglow with warm light against the dusk. The butler greeted her with the precision of one who had long since mastered the art of refined indifference. Inside, she was led to the drawing-room, where the other guests were gathered. Lady Eleanor, looking as elegant as ever, but with an unmistakable tension in her bearing, greeted her warmly. "Jane, my dear, I can't tell you how pleased I am that you could come." Sir Reginald, a lean, grey-haired man with piercing eyes, observed her from his seat near the fireplace. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, but his fingers tapped impatiently against the armrest. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" His voice was deep, commanding. "Eleanor speaks highly of you. I assume you're not entirely a stranger to music." "Oh, I have a great fondness for it," Miss Marple said demurely, "though I fear my experience has been largely confined to church choirs and village concerts." Sir Reginald gave a short bark of laughter. "Well, let us hope you have an ear for more than just music tonight." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. But inwardly, she wondered, was that a simple remark or a warning? Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. Dinner at Ashworth Manor was as elegant as one might expect of an old English estate, but there was a distinct chill beneath the polite conversation. The great dining hall, with its high ceilings and soft candlelight, seemed to absorb the tensions of its occupants, turning what should have been a refined gathering into something far less comfortable. Miss Marple, seated at Lady Eleanor Danforth's right, quietly observed the dynamics of the evening with her usual shrewdness. Age had granted her the patience to sit, listen, and piece together patterns of human nature as easily as she might unravel a tangled ball of wool. And tonight she found herself particularly intrigued by the host and his guests. Sir Reginald Ashworth, an aging but formidable man with an aristocratic bearing, sat at the head of the table, fingers drumming lightly against the polished wood. His silvered hair was neatly combed back, his features still sharp despite his years. He spoke a little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of authority, and those around him listened, sometimes with deference, sometimes with barely concealed resentment. His wife, Lady Ashworth, was a woman of statuesque beauty, though time and disappointment had hardened her features. She held her knife and fork with precise elegance, but her lips were pressed too tightly together, as though she was swallowing words she dared not speak. At the far end of the table sat Henry Ashworth, the nephew. A young man in his early 30s, Henry was handsome in a way that suggested he had once relied on charm to smooth his path through life. However, tonight, there was a distinct air of discontent about him. More than once, he cast dark glances toward his uncle, and when he did speak, it was with an edge of barely concealed frustration. Then there was Bernard Hale. Miss Marple had not seen the pianist in years, but his presence had hardly changed. A man once considered a prodigy, Hale had aged into a figure of brooding intensity. His movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were forever playing to an audience. The lines around his mouth suggested bitterness, and his eyes never lingered on Sir Reginald, without a glint of something resembling resentment. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, was an entirely different sort of man, neat, nervous, and rather too eager to avoid drawing attention to himself. He looked distinctly uncomfortable whenever the subject of inheritance arose, which happened more than once. And finally, there was Oliver Graves, the secretary. A quiet man, unobtrusive, to the point of near invisibility, Graves had the sort of presence that might go unnoticed if one weren't paying close attention. He spoke only when spoken to, his voice soft and measured, but his eyes, dark and knowing, missed nothing. Miss Marple took all of this in as the dinner progressed, though she said very little herself. She had always believed that people revealed more when they did not think they were being watched. It was during the course of the main course that Sir Reginald chose to speak. "Well," he said, setting down his wine glass with a deliberate clink, "it seems appropriate to mention, since so many of you appear to be dancing around the subject, that I intend to finalize my new will within the next week." A sharp silence followed his words. Mr. Weston cleared his throat. Lady Ashworth's fork scraped too harshly against her plate. Henry's expression darkened. "I see, and might we know what these changes entail?" Sir Reginald gave a slow smile, the kind that held no warmth. "That, my dear boy, is my business." Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Bernard Hale let out a soft, derisive chuckle. "And what of you, Hale?" Sir Reginald continued, turning his attention to the pianist. "No cutting remarks tonight?" Bernard's fingers tapped lightly against his wine glass. "Oh, I learned long ago, Reginald, that some battles are not worth fighting. You've had your victories. Let us leave it at that." Sir Reginald smirked. A gracious sentiment, if uncharacteristic. Miss Marple noted the way Bernard's fingers had tightened around his glass. Whatever history lay between them, it was not as resolved as Hale pretended. The conversation carried on, though the mood remained tense. When the final course was served, Sir Reginald dabbed his lips with his napkin and rose from his chair. "I believe I shall retire to my music room," he announced. "I find that a good nocturne is the perfect end to an evening." Lady Ashworth let out a barely audible sigh of relief. Bernard Hale, however, gave a thin-lipped smile. "Still keeping to old habits," he mused. "You always did have a peculiar fondness for that nocturne of yours." Sir Reginald's gaze was cold. "Some things," he said, "are timeless." Miss Marple watched as he strode from the room, his movements as precise and deliberate as ever. As the guests lingered, Miss Marple noted how the atmosphere subtly changed in Sir Reginald's absence. Lady Ashworth relaxed slightly, her shoulders no longer quite so rigid. Henry poured himself another glass of wine, the irritation on his face giving way to something unreadable. Bernard Hale tapped his fingers idly against the table, lost in thought. Mr. Weston, looking greatly relieved, finally allowed himself to finish his brandy, and Miss Marple? She simply sat and observed. There was something in the air tonight, something unseen yet undeniably present. A tension, a shadow of something brewing beneath the surface. As the first notes of Sir Reginald's nocturne drifted through the halls of Ashworth Manor, Miss Marple found herself wondering, not for the first time, if she had stepped into a house that was waiting for tragedy to strike. Chapter 3. A tune cut short. The strains of music floated through the grand halls of Ashworth Manor, weaving their way through the corridors and under the heavy doors like a ghostly presence. It was a piece Miss Marple recognized, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, played with a technical precision that spoke of years of disciplined practice, yet entirely devoid of warmth. Sir Reginald Ashworth had always been known for his skill at the piano, but not for his soul. Even in music, he approached things with calculation rather than emotion. The guests lingered in the drawing room, sipping their drinks, making small talk that never quite settled into comfort. Henry Ashworth leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire, his fingers drumming against his armrest. Bernard Hale paced near the window, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if contemplating something deeply unpleasant. Lady Ashworth sat stiffly, her hands resting on the arms of her chair, though she seemed far away in thought. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, had checked his watch twice in the past 10 minutes, glancing toward the door, as though hoping for an excuse to leave. Miss Marple, as always, sat quietly, knitting in her lap, her sharp eyes moving between the guests. She had learned long ago that one could tell a great deal about a person by watching them when they thought no one was looking. Then, abruptly, the music stopped, not at the natural conclusion of the piece, not with the gentle fading of a final note. No, the sound simply cut off, a note half played, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. A moment later, a piercing scream rang through the house. The guests froze, their gazes snapping toward the door. Then chaos. Lady Ashworth gasped, rising to her feet. Henry stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled over. Bernard Hale, without a word, strode toward the hallway, his steps urgent. Miss Marple, ever practical, placed her knitting neatly on the side table before following the others toward the source of the scream. The music room lay at the far end of the corridor, its grand oak doors slightly ajar. Light spilled through the crack, pooling onto the polished floor. Inside, Oliver Graves, the secretary, stood frozen in the doorway, his face deathly pale. His mouth worked as if trying to form words, but none came. Beyond him, the scene was unmistakable. Sir Reginald Ashworth sat at the piano, slumped forward, his lifeless fingers resting against the keys. His head lay at an unnatural angle, his forehead pressed against the polished wood. The sheet music before him was torn slightly at the corner, as though a hand had clutched at it in a final moment of desperation. The grand clock in the hall had stopped. 10 p.m. Mr. Weston was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. A heart attack. Bernard Hale let out a short, mirthless laugh. Convenient, isn't it? Henry Ashworth took a step forward, his expression unreadable. Is he... Miss Marple moved closer. She had seen death before, more than once, and though she was no physician, she knew the difference between a man who had died peacefully and one who had not. There was something too perfect about Sir Reginald's position, as if he had been placed there. A man who suffered a fatal attack at the piano would slump sideways or even fall to the floor. He would not remain upright, his fingers resting so delicately upon the keys. Her sharp blue eyes flickered over the details, the torn corner of the sheet music. The clock stopped precisely at the moment of death, the expression frozen on Sir Reginald's face, not one of peace, nor even pain, but shock. A quiet sort of horror settled over her. This was not a natural death, this was murder. Oliver Graves had finally regained the ability to move. Swallowing hard, he whispered, I only came to bring him his tea." He gestured weakly toward the small silver tray on a side table, the cup untouched. I knocked, but he didn't answer. The music had stopped, so I thought. His voice broke off, and he shuddered. Henry Ashworth exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "We need to call the police." Bernard Hale, still staring at the body, muttered, "Yes." "Call them. Let them deal with this mess." Miss Marple, however, was already deep in thought. She moved carefully, her sharp gaze missing nothing. The torn sheet music. Why had it been gripped so tightly? The stopped clock. Had someone done that deliberately? And most importantly, why had Sir Reginald been so shocked? She knew the answer was there, somewhere nestled among the details. And she would find it. Chapter 4. The Marks of Murder. Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived at Ashworth Manor with the air of a man who had seen everything before but was always prepared to be surprised. A seasoned detective with a patient but unyielding manner, he cast a careful eye over the gathered guests before stepping into the music room, where Sir Reginald Ashworth's lifeless body remained seated at the piano. Miss Marple, standing a few feet away, observed him closely. She had always liked Inspector Craddock. He was thorough, sensible, and, most importantly, not dismissive of unconventional methods of deduction. He nodded in acknowledgement of her presence before turning his attention to the corpse. The first detail that struck him was what had already unsettled Miss Marple, the unnatural positioning of the body. Sir Reginald's posture was too composed, his fingers still resting on the keys, his head merely drooping forward. Then Craddock noticed something else. Dark bruises forming around the throat, faint but unmistakable. He turned sharply to his sergeant. "Send for Dr. Whitaker, but I'll tell you now this wasn't natural causes. This man was strangled." A collective intake of breath echoed from the guests who had gathered at the doorway. Even those who had seemed composed now wore expressions of shock or, in some cases, something more ambiguous. Miss Marple, for her part, merely pursed her lips. It was as she had suspected. Craddock straightened and looked around the room. "Strangled," he repeated almost to himself. And yet, no sign of a struggle. How very odd. He turned to face the gathered household. "Now then, I'll need to speak with each of you." Inspector Craddock began his questioning in the drawing room, where the guests were seated at varying distances from one another, like players at a game of chess. Lady Ashworth sat near the fireplace, her expression cool and unreadable. When asked about her husband, she did not hesitate to speak her mind. "I despised him," she said simply. There was a murmur of surprise, though Miss Marple noted how Henry Ashworth merely folded his arms as if unsurprised. Lady Ashworth continued, her voice crisp and unwavering. "Reginald was a cruel man. He enjoyed control over me, over this house, over everyone he dealt with. I stayed because society expected it of me. But if you think I am mourning, you are mistaken." Craddock watched her carefully. "And where were you at the time of his death?" "In the drawing room. You may ask anyone here." He did just that. The alibi held, though it did not exonerate her completely. Henry Ashworth was next. The young man was clearly agitated, his fingers tapping restlessly against the armrest of his chair. "I won't pretend I got along with my uncle," he admitted. "But I certainly didn't kill him." Craddock studied him. "Did you know he was changing his will?" Henry hesitated, a flicker of something crossing his face. "Yes," he said at last. "I found out earlier this evening." "And you weren't happy about it?" "Would you be?" Henry shot back. "I've been expecting that inheritance my entire life, and now he suddenly decides to change things. Of course I was furious, but that doesn't mean I—" He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "Look, I didn't kill him." Mr. Weston, the solicitor, looked deeply uncomfortable throughout the questioning. His hands fussed with his cuffs, his gaze flickering to the door, as though wishing to escape. "Yes, Sir Reginald intended to revise his will," he admitted. Though the final version had not yet been signed, Craddock narrowed his eyes. "And who stood to benefit?" Weston swallowed. "I'm not at liberty to discuss such matters." Craddock leaned forward slightly. "Sir, your client is dead. You can either tell me now or I will find out through other means." The solicitor hesitated. Then with clear reluctance he said, "His secretary, Mr. Graves." He was to be the new primary beneficiary. A stunned silence followed. All eyes turned to Bernard Hale. Unlike the others, he did not appear nervous. In fact, there was a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Well, well," he murmured, glancing toward Oliver Graves. "What an interesting turn of events." Craddock, unimpressed, turned his attention to Hale. "And you, sir? You and Sir Reginald had a history, I understand." "Indeed," Hale said, stretching his long fingers. "We were rivals once. He won competitions I should have won. He received praise I should have received. And, of course, he enjoyed lording it over me whenever he could. And you resented him for it." "Oh, very much," Hale said lightly. Then he smiled thinly. "But I didn't need to kill him for revenge, Inspector. You see, time already did that for me. He was a bitter old man clinging to past glories. What satisfaction would I gain from his death now?" Last was Oliver Graves. Unlike the others, he remained utterly composed, his face unreadable. "So, Mr. Graves," Craddock said, "you were about to inherit a great deal of money." "I had no idea," Graves said simply. "You expect us to believe that?" "I do not expect anything, Inspector," Graves replied. "I only deal in facts, and the fact is I did not kill Sir Reginald." Craddock studied him for a long moment. "Where were you at the time of death?" "In my room." "Alone?" "Yes." The detective sighed, a flimsy alibi. And yet something about Graves's manner made him difficult to read. Miss Marple, watching from her chair, noted how carefully measured Graves's responses were. A man who revealed neither too much nor too little. A man who had learned perhaps that silence was its own form of power. As the questioning ended, Craddock stood, addressing them all. "Sir Reginald Ashworth was murdered, of that I have no doubt. One of you knows more than you are saying." A tense silence settled over the room. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already knitting the threads of the case together. It was not just about the will, it was not just about past grudges, it was something more. And she intended to find out what. Chapter 5. A Note of Suspicion. The drawing room at Ashworth Manor had grown cold, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Tension had settled over the guests like a heavy fog, each person retreating into their own thoughts, calculating, remembering, perhaps even regretting. Miss Marple, however, was not sitting idly. While Inspector Craddock continued his questioning of the household, she made her way, quietly and unnoticed, back to the music room. The great piano loomed in the dimly lit chamber, its polished ebony surface gleaming in the light of a single candelabra. The instrument, like everything else in Sir Reginald's world, had been maintained to perfection. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the room once more, taking in the details others had dismissed, the torn sheet music, the grand clock frozen at exactly 10 p.m. And then she looked at the piano itself. She had sat near it earlier in the evening, her gloved hands resting lightly upon the polished surface. Had she imagined it then? That peculiar, fleeting sensation? A tiny sting, almost imperceptible, like the brush of a needle. She stepped forward, her lace-gloved fingers gliding over the keys. Carefully, deliberately, she played the opening notes of Nocturne in E-flat major, the very piece Sir Reginald had been performing when he met his untimely end. As the melody unfolded, she felt it again, a prick, barely noticeable beneath her fingertip. Miss Marple paused, then pressed the key once more, but with greater force. This time she felt it distinctly, a sharp, almost invisible sting. She withdrew her hand at once, her mind racing. Something was hidden within the piano. Miss Marple, ever practical, removed her gloves and leaned in for a closer look. The polished wood and ivory gave no immediate indication of anything unusual. And yet when she lightly ran her fingers over the keys, she detected something, a nearly imperceptible gap between the ivory of one particular key and its wooden base. She reached into her knitting bag, producing a long, slender hatpin. Carefully, she inserted it into the tiny gap and applied a bit of pressure. There was a faint click. A mechanism inside the key shifted, and for the briefest moment, a sliver of metal, no longer than the tip of a sewing needle, emerged from the surface before retracting just as swiftly. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, her expression one of deep satisfaction. "Quite ingenious," she murmured, her eyes twinkling. "A hidden trap, designed to pierce the skin only when a particular key was pressed with enough force." And if her suspicions were correct, the tiny needle had been coated with something lethal. The implications were chilling. Sir Reginald had died at his piano, appearing to have slumped naturally over the keys. But he had not been strangled in the traditional sense. Rather, he had been poisoned through the very instrument he cherished. Miss Marple straightened, her mind working through the puzzle with precise efficiency. Someone had known Sir Reginald's habits intimately. They had counted on the fact that he played the same nocturne every evening, striking the same keys with precision, and they had prepared a fatal trap, one that required no direct confrontation, no struggle, no overt act of violence. All it had taken was a single touch. A quick test was required. She retrieved a clean handkerchief from her bag and, using the hatpin, gently pressed it against the tip of the needle. Then, she carefully held the fabric near the candle's flame. Within moments, a dark stain appeared, a telltale reaction to the presence of certain poisons. Miss Marple nodded to herself. Yes, it was exactly as she had suspected. A fast-acting toxin, one that would have sent Sir Reginald into immediate shock, rendering him incapable of calling for help. It was a method of murder both elegant and ruthless. Miss Marple sat back, considering her next move. The killer had set a very particular trap, which meant they must have known Sir Reginald's routine, down to the finest detail. And that in itself was revealing. Few people had access to the music room. Fewer still would have had the technical knowledge to rig such a mechanism. The prime suspects had already presented themselves: Lady Ashworth, who had openly admitted to loathing her husband; Henry Ashworth, who had learned that he was being written out of the will; Bernard Hale, a man who had spent decades resenting Sir Reginald's musical success; Mr. Weston, the nervous solicitor, privy to the contents of the new will; Oliver Graves, the secretary, who was to become the unexpected heir. Each had a motive, but only one had possessed the patience, the skill, and the knowledge to construct such an elaborate means of murder. Miss Marple rose from the piano bench, her expression as serene as ever. She had everything she needed. The only thing left was to set the stage and let the guilty party reveal themselves. Chapter 6. The motive revealed. The discovery of the poisoned needle had, in Miss Marple's mind, solidified one crucial fact. The murder of Sir Reginald Ashworth had not been a crime of passion, nor a hastily conceived act of violence. It had been premeditated with the utmost precision. The killer had known Sir Reginald's habits intimately, had counted on his rigid routine, and had been confident enough in their plan to let fate do the work for them. That kind of patience required something far stronger than greed or jealousy. It required hatred. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving methodically, as her mind unraveled the tangled threads of the past. She had seen the way Oliver Graves, the secretary, had stood apart from the others, not in a way that suggested nervousness nor even guilt, but in a way that spoke of a man who had already made peace with his actions. A quiet man, observant, unobtrusive. The kind of man people forgot was even in the room. And yet, he had been the one to discover the body. Miss Marple's fingers tightened briefly around her knitting needles. She had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and she knew the signs of someone who had spent years biding their time. Miss Marple, ever resourceful, had a quiet word with Inspector Craddock. The police, naturally, had already begun their own inquiries into the household. But Miss Marple, with her uncanny ability to know just where to look, suggested a line of investigation that had not yet been considered. It did not take long to uncover what she had suspected. Years ago, before Oliver Graves had come into Sir Reginald's employment, another man had held the very same position. Oliver's father, Albert Graves. Albert had been Sir Reginald's trusted assistant for over a decade. By all accounts, he had been a quiet, diligent worker much like his son, but one day he had been dismissed suddenly and without explanation. The official reason, a financial discrepancy, a sum of money unaccounted for. The truth? Sir Reginald had never liked excuses, nor had he cared for due process. The accusation alone had been enough for him to cast Albert Graves aside. Albert, disgraced, had never worked in a respectable household again. With his reputation ruined, he had spiraled into despair. His health declined rapidly, and within a few years, he was dead, a ruined man. Miss Marple sat in her chair, her hands still now, her knitting forgotten in her lap. It was a familiar story, power used cruelly, a man's life destroyed on the whim of someone who thought themselves untouchable. And then, his son had returned. Not as an avenger, at least not openly. No, Oliver Graves had taken the same position his father had once held. He had waited, biding his time, gaining Sir Reginald's trust, knowing that one day an opportunity would come. And come it had. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward Oliver Graves, seated in the corner of the room, his face as impassive as ever. Had he suspected that someone might uncover the truth? Or had he truly believed that his crime was as perfect as it seemed? She watched as the others spoke. Lady Ashworth's bitterness, Henry's frustration, Bernard Hale's cynicism, Weston's nervousness. They all had motives, yes, but none of them had the depth of resolve required to wait years for revenge. Oliver, on the other hand, had built his entire life around it. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, allowing herself a small smile. Revenge was an old, old game, and it was rarely won by the impatient. She set her cup down with a delicate clink. She had everything she needed. Now, it was simply a matter of revealing the truth. Chapter 7. The Final Performance. The great music room of Ashworth Manor had never felt so solemn. The once grand space with its gleaming piano and shelves filled with bound compositions was now steeped in an air of finality. The guests, now suspects, had been summoned at Miss Marple's quiet request. They arrived one by one, each carrying the weight of the past night's events upon their shoulders. Lady Ashworth sat stiffly in one of the velvet-backed chairs, her hands folded in her lap. Henry Ashworth leaned against the grand fireplace, arms crossed, his gaze dark with frustration. Bernard Hale stood near the bookshelves, running a hand over the spines as if searching for a distraction. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, lingered near the doorway, uneasy as ever, and Oliver Graves, the last to enter, moved with his usual quiet presence, his face unreadable. Inspector Craddock stood nearby, allowing Miss Marple to take the lead. She did not raise her voice. She never had to. With calm precision, she began. It was a most unusual murder, Miss Marple said, looking around the room with her keen blue eyes. Elegant in its way, ingenious, and I dare say, long in the making. She moved toward the piano, running her fingers lightly across the keys without pressing them. Sir Reginald, as we all knew, was a man of habit. Every evening he played this piano, and every evening he played the same nocturne, a piece so familiar to him that he barely needed to glance at the keys. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. And someone here knew that. A ripple of unease passed through the room. The method was clever, Miss Marple continued, a tiny, spring-loaded needle hidden within a particular key, one Sir Reginald struck with force every night. It emerged just long enough to pierce his skin, such a small thing, so quick, but enough to deliver a fatal dose of poison. Henry exhaled sharply. Poison? Miss Marple nodded. A fast-acting toxin, a substance that would cause near instantaneous paralysis. A victim would slump forward, unable to call for help, appearing as though they had simply stopped. Her gaze moved to the grand hall clock. And then there is this. The clock stopped at exactly 10 p.m. A deliberate attempt to fix the time of death, to ensure an alibi. She turned back to the group. It was a crime of patience, a crime of planning, and it was committed by someone with access to this piano, someone who had reason to hate Sir Reginald, and yet someone he trusted implicitly. She allowed a moment of silence before finally, gently, speaking the name. Mr. Oliver Graves. There was no outburst, no protest. Oliver Graves did not so much as flinch. Instead, he merely regarded Miss Marple with an expression of mild curiosity. And what leads you to that conclusion, Miss Marple? She smiled, almost kindly. The truth is, Oliver, you were never a suspect at first. You were too invisible. And that, you see, was your strength. You made yourself indispensable to Sir Reginald, just as your father once was. You were the quiet observer, the loyal secretary, the man no one ever looked at twice. A flicker of something, amusement, crossed Oliver's face. Miss Marple continued, but when I discovered how Sir Reginald was killed, I had to ask myself, who would take the time to construct such a trap? Who had access to the piano for long enough to alter it without detection? Who had the knowledge to select a poison that would kill without struggle? She folded her hands. The answer, of course, was you. And then I learned about your father. The room seemed to shrink. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. We made inquiries, Mr. Graves. We know that your father was dismissed from Sir Reginald's service. We know he fell into disgrace because of an unproven accusation. We know that ultimately his life was ruined. And we know that you came back here years later under a different name, with one clear purpose. For the first time, Oliver Graves truly reacted. His lips parted slightly. The first sign of something breaking through his composed mask. Miss Marple regarded him gently. You waited, didn't you? Years of patience, years of quiet resentment. And then finally, you found the perfect way to strike back. A method your father, who had been so careful, so devoted, would have appreciated. Precision, poise, a performance, if you will. Oliver let out a soft breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. You're very clever, Miss Marple, he murmured. I should have known you would see it. He turned to Inspector Craddock. There's no need for a fuss. I'll come quietly. No denials, no protestations of innocence. As the police moved to escort him away, Oliver Graves glanced once more at the piano. It was a beautiful tune, wasn't it? He said softly. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, just as softly. But you must remember, Mr. Graves, that revenge, no matter how elegantly performed, is always a discordant note in the end. And with that, Oliver Graves was led away. The room remained still, filled only with the silence of an unfinished melody. Chapter 8. A tune that never lies. With the departure of the police, a strange quiet settled over Ashworth Manor. The weight of the evening still lingered in the air, but there was also a sense of finality, like the last note of a long, dramatic composition. Lady Ashworth sat back in her chair and exhaled, almost as if she had been holding her breath for years. There was no sadness in her expression, only a kind of release. "Well," she said briskly, adjusting a bracelet on her wrist, "I suppose there will be matters to attend to. I shall leave the mourning to those who feel inclined." Across the room, Henry Ashworth wasted no time before asking, "And the will?" His voice was carefully neutral, but Miss Marple detected the unmistakable edge of eagerness beneath it. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, cleared his throat and fidgeted with his cuffs. "The new will was never signed," he admitted, glancing at the gathered guests. "The last executed version still stands." There was a beat of silence. Then Henry, who had seemed tense all evening, let out a quiet breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. He had expected to lose his inheritance. Now, quite unexpectedly, it was his, once again. Bernard Hale chuckled, shaking his head as he poured himself another glass of brandy. The old man spent his life controlling everything, he mused, always dictating, always making sure the world bent to his will. And yet the one thing he didn't finalize is the only thing that matters now. There was a dry amusement in his tone, but also something else, a hint of satisfaction. Miss Marple, who had remained silent for much of the conversation, finally rose from her chair. Unlike the others, she had little interest in the will or the practicalities that followed. Her thoughts were elsewhere. She wandered back into the music room, drawn by something she could not quite explain. The grand piano stood in the dim light, silent and unassuming. And yet it had played a part in murder just as surely as if it had been an accomplice. Miss Marple moved toward it with quiet reverence, running her fingers lightly across the keys. Without thinking, she pressed down and let the familiar strains of Nocturne in E-flat major fill the air. The melody was soft, delicate. It was the very same tune that had led Sir Reginald to his death. A moment later, footsteps approached. Inspector Craddock leaned against the doorframe, watching her with mild curiosity. "I didn't take you for a pianist, Miss Marple." She gave a small smile, finishing the phrase before lifting her hands from the keys. "Oh, I wouldn't claim to be one," she admitted. "But music is rather like human nature, don't you think? Patterns, habits, repetitions. And sometimes hidden notes, things only the careful listener will ever notice." Craddock folded his arms. "You knew it was Oliver Graves from the start, didn't you?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not at first. But once I understood how Sir Reginald was killed, I had to ask myself who had the patience, the skill, and the knowledge to construct such a trap. And then, of course, there was his father's story." Craddock sighed. "Revenge, a long time to wait for it." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but revenge, Inspector, is never quite as sweet as people imagine." She tapped one of the keys lightly. "This piano never lied. It did precisely what it was meant to do, but people—" She smiled ruefully. "People always do." Craddock chuckled. "Well, it's all wrapped up now, thanks to you." Miss Marple gave a modest shrug. "Oh, it was all there to be seen, Inspector. One simply had to listen." She smoothed down her coat, glancing once more at the piano. "It's time I returned to St. Mary Mead," she said cheerfully. Murder is all very well, but I find a little gardening and a quiet cup of tea far more satisfying." And with that, she turned and left, leaving behind nothing but the lingering melody of a tune that had never lied.